Thanks everybody for joining me, taking some time out of your day to join me in this super topical hot topic presentation. You may have seen me before. I've given this presentation a few times now, but every time I give it, it's different. Things are moving so fast in this area of the law that honestly, every time I give the presentation, I have to update it. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about vaccinations, this new normal that we're entering, bringing your employees back to work, what you guys can be doing on job sites for your contractors, your subcontractors, and just kind of moving on. Hopefully we can put this behind us, but before we can do that, there's some more hurdles that you guys as employers and workplaces are going to have to go through. So these are some of the headlines that we are bombarded with every single day. Is there's employees who want to stay home. We're seeing the development of a vaccine passport here in Manitoba. It's going to be on our cell phones really soon. There's some remote workers who don't want to come back, some who really want to come back, and now employers have downsized their office spaces or whatever, and maybe don't have the ability to bring them back. So things are changing, and it's a pretty exciting time to be a labor and employment lawyer, I'll tell you that. Okay, let's just kind of jump right into it. So yeah, like I said, we're going to talk about the new normal. We're going to talk about some suggested policies that you may already have in your workplace, but there's other ones that you probably hadn't thought of. We're going to talk definitely about mandatory vaccines, how you can make that work in your workplace. And then of course, there will be some takeaways. So if you want to tune out and tune back in when I say bottom line, feel free to do that. So the new normal. Some companies continue to have employees doing their jobs from home, and employers really demonstrated a really kind of phenomenal transition to work from home when it was kind of required of us to do last year back in March. But now that that the numbers are trending downwards, the first objective that you guys will have as employers and workplaces is definitely maintaining a safe workplace. So employers have a duty to protect the health and safety of their workers, and employers are required to implement preventative measures in their workplaces. Failure to ensure a safe workplace can lead to liability under occupational health and safety legislation. So this includes fines, penalties, and in those really, really serious cases that we don't like to see, criminal prosecution and that kind of liability for employers. To meet their obligations to provide a safe workplace, it's imperative that you guys are updating your policies all the time. I actually just last week reviewed a policy for one of my clients, and the last time it had been updated kind of from a COVID perspective was March 2020. And let me tell you, that policy was out of date. There was so much that had changed since March 2020. The language has changed completely, basically. The expectations and the requirements of employers has changed. So I am, kind of advising you that make sure that you're always reviewing those policies, especially right now. Just like in March 2020, when we saw all the rules coming in, right now is a really rapid time of change. So make sure that you're reviewing those frequently. Make sure you're calling your lawyer just to make sure that you guys are all above board, and kind of identifying the hazards and developing the right COVID policies for your workplace. Employers are not obligated to accommodate an employee's desire to work from home. So just because somebody wants to work from home doesn't mean you have to let them work from home. And if an employee's request is based on a preference, that's obviously going to be less substantial than if it's based on perhaps a human right or an illness or something. Those cases are going to be a little bit more different. But if somebody just wants to be working from home, you don't have to let them work from home. But we're going to talk a little bit more about accommodation as we kind of go forward here. I think that's all on this slide. Okay, so here come those kind of necessary policies that you guys have to have. So things that you can consider as employers, again, these aren't required policies, all of them. Workplace safety and health, violence, accommodation, those are going to be mandatory, but technology policies, expense reimbursement, confidentiality, accountability, making sure that when your employees are working from home, they're actually working, something that we'd all, really hope to see. But things are changing. So, technology policies. what kind of expectation of privacy, who's supplying the computer, who's supplying the cell phone, who's supplying the monitors. Make sure that you are thinking about those things, kind of getting ahead of those problems before you see them with expense reimbursement. Are you required to pay your employee's internet bill? No. But there may be times where that's necessary, or if you're requiring somebody to work from home. So you have to think about what kind of expenses you want to be covering, and making sure that that's properly communicated to your workforce. So if there's something that you're absolutely not going to pay for, if an employer really, really wants to do a monitor system, but at work they only have one, but it would be ergonomical for them to have two at home. That's not something that you have to cover, but make sure that you're just communicating what's going to be covered with your employees and what's not going to be covered kind of ahead of time. Again, confidentiality. So more and more people are working from home, spouses, families. How are you ensuring that your employees are keeping your information confidential when they're at home? So make sure you have a policy in place. What is an employee supposed to do? Where are they supposed to take phone calls? How are they supposed to attend on a Zoom meeting? I have a headset, so what I say, somebody around me could hear, but what would be said on the Zoom call may not be heard. But do you expect your employees to be private when they're on these calls at home? Just things that you have to think about. And then again, too, having an accountability policy. So maybe more frequent check-ins with your staff, having them attest to doing work, just simply saying that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, checking in on them. These are all policies that you can be contemplating, you can be implementing in your workplace to, adhere to this new normal. We don't have to bring employees back to work. In some cases, it's really beneficial to have employees. Some people are super happy to work from home. So if there's no reason to bring them home and they're happy working at home, you can have them working at home, but just there's things that you need to be kind of considering. And then, so that goes for those mandatory policies like a workplace safety and health policy and a violence policy. As an employer, it is your responsibility to make sure that an employee's workplace is safe. So if they are working at home and their workplace is their home, it's still your obligation under law to ensure that that workplace is safe. So something that, maybe you haven't turned your mind to, but was definitely a big concern at the beginning of the pandemic, is how domestic violence would impact work from home. As an employer, you still kind of have a duty to protect people. So if people are, at home, there's some frightening statistics about how many women and how many people in general kind of felt unsafe when they knew that they would have to be working from home. It's still your responsibility as an employer to ensure that your employees are safe. So, whether that be, maybe again, like I said, more frequent check-ins, checking in on your employees one-on-one, having them appear on a video, just, kind of doing well-being checks. That's all something that you can be doing, thinking about, and just kind of maybe something you hadn't turned your mind to when it comes to keeping your employees safe in the workplace. A big question that I get asked a lot is, do your employees have to work from home? Many people are working from remote locations. This is challenging what the idea of an office looks like in 2021. For some people, working from home means working from their home. Other people, it means working from their cabin, maybe in Kenora, which is in Ontario. And for other people, it means leaving the country altogether, maybe working from Mexico. A friend of mine who he's a lawyer out in Ottawa, he kind of did the approach that I would not recommend. He kind of asked for forgiveness instead of permission, went to Hawaii to work from Hawaii, and told his employer he'd be working from Hawaii for a month. As an employer, what can you do about this? There's lots of things you need to think about. Basically, you're going to want to make sure that your employees are working in the same jurisdiction. So if somebody wants to go to the cabin, probably not going to have a lot of difficulty with that, but there's tax considerations. Again, you are still obligated to ensure that your employee is safe. How can you possibly ensure that your employee is going to be safe when they're working from Hawaii? So tax considerations, corporate tax rates are going to vary from province to province. So you need to make sure that you're considering all of these things before you just let an employee go off and work wherever. As a lawyer, I can practice in another jurisdiction for 90 days and my licensing would still be covered. But after that 90 days has elapsed, I wouldn't be covered by my insurance. So these are things that you need to be thinking of. Make sure you know where your employees are working from when they say they're working from home. But a cabin in Gimli, that should be fine. There's very little that would differ from Winnipeg to Gimli, but make sure you know kind of where your employees are, and it's not unreasonable to ask them where they're going to be. There was recently a case with a university professor out of Quebec who had he had a vacation property. He owned property again in Hawaii, funny enough. And at the start of the pandemic, he had asked kind of for permission to go and work remotely. His employer said no. So he stayed at home. His family, his wife and children, went to Hawaii to live in Hawaii. He stayed home as per his employer. As the pandemic kind of didn't end, he asked again if he could go and work remotely because he was still just working from his home office. The workplace again said no, and he challenged that. And it was kind of established that because his child was sick, there was some kind of exceptional circumstances in his case, but the courts found in Quebec, which again, this isn't something we can totally rely on, but it's at least giving us an idea of how this question could be answered. But yes, because there was exceptional circumstances, he was permitted to go and be with his family, but the court said it wouldn't be unreasonable for his employer to deny him that. So yeah, lots of things. Payroll deduction. So again, like tax, make sure that what taxes are you going to be withholding from your employee who is a Manitoba resident but working in Ontario, which deductions need to be paid, Manitoba's rates or Ontario's rates. These are all kind of important considerations, and that don't really kind of come to mind when your employee says, hey, can I go work at my cabin in Lake of the Woods? You should really be thinking about that kind of more fulsomely before you kind of grant that permission. And again, which employment standards law are going to apply to remote work. So I think we may expect some sort of change in this area as the workplace and the office really changes. Something that comes to mind for me is what a non-compete looks like as kind of the world expands globally and we're all being more comfortable with remote work. Non-competes, non-solicitation agreements, those are usually really, really restricted and really tight to a geographical area. But as the world opens up, that's something that could change. So make sure you're just thinking of all these things. It's hard to think of everything. So if you have questions, make sure you're calling your lawyer. Okay, so kind of the reason for the season here, can employers make vaccination mandatory for every worker? And this is actually something that hasn't changed as many times as I've given this presentation. The short answer is no, not really. As eligibility to receive the COVID-19 vaccine continues to expand across Canada, some employers are considering making immunization mandatory in their workplaces. But I'm recommending that employers be cautious in implementing these measures. It's not to say that you can't in every circumstance, but you're going to have to be cautious as you do implement these measures. There's going to be exceptions that will prevent you from ever probably seeing that 100% vaccination rate in your workplace. There's going to be human rights considerations. There's going to be maybe illness or some sort of allergy to the vaccine. So there's going to be really legitimate reasons for why somebody can't get the vaccine. So you're probably going to be prevented from seeing that 100% vaccination rate in your workplace. But that's not to say that you can't do anything. Just because you can't have a 100% vaccination rate, there are things you can do as an employer, as a work site, as a workplace to kind of get closer and closer to that 100% vaccination rate. All of this to say though, it may not end up being necessary. I think we've exceeded 70% of Manitobans have already taken up that first dose of the vaccine, and we're seeing that second dose climb steadily. I'm fully vaccinated already. So it may not be something that you need to worry about. Maybe your employers, I know all of my colleagues here are eager to get the vaccine. checking for when they're eligible, making that appointment as soon as possible. So if that's kind of the, the vibe in your workplace, you may not need to make a policy mandatory. But I understand that there's lots of people who do want to make this a policy and to keep their employees and their customers and their clients safe. So what can we do about it? Every time I gave this presentation previously, I had said, oh, this is so far off. The vaccine rollout has been so slow. We don't even need to really think about this. But that has certainly changed. So we can lean on existing policies, existing procedures that you guys have in your workplace to guide us on how to implement this safely and kind of to limit your exposure as an employer. I would say take a cautious approach. Every implementation of a mandatory vaccine policy, and I've written a few now, is really fact specific. It's workplace specific. There's no kind of blanket policy that I can just send you and say, hey, this should work for your workplace. It's being crafted certainly to every workplace. Let's see here. Okay, so why is this so unclear? Law is unfortunately very, it's reactive, it's not proactive. So I can't tell you if you can for sure have a mandatory vaccine policy. There's going to be policies that get challenged by, human rights tribunals. Some people are going to feel that, yeah, it's against their rights to have this policy. So we're going to see these kinds of policies be challenged going forward. But we can look to previous influenzas, so the flu shot, how those are, how those test cases have been rolled out, how in the SARS pandemic there was, vaccine or mask policies being implemented. So it's unclear, and I can't give you a for sure answer, but there's lots of things that we can do kind of right now and talk about right now to give us at least some idea of what is reasonable. And so I've already kind of covered this. This is what I was saying at my old presentations, but that is no longer the case. It's definitely not too soon to be considering implementing these policies. You can start to work with your lawyer to develop these policies. We're doing lots of them here. So feel free to contact me if this is something that you think you'd like to see in your workplace. So like I said, potential risks here are the reasonableness. There's no straight answer. So when this does get challenged, and I expect that it will, it's going to come down to what's reasonable. So it'll be on the employer to show that this policy was reasonable. So to say, every employee must be vaccinated, no exceptions, that policy is going to be unreasonable. And but there's lots of, having a policy that says you have to be vaccinated or wear a mask, that's going to be considered more reasonable. You have to be vaccinated because we work with a high-risk population. That may be reasonable. But if you run a job site and everything is outdoors and people are able to effectively socially distance, that may be considered less reasonable. So it's all going to come down to what is reasonable, and it's hard to say where the courts are going to draw that line. But and kind of what I'm advising my clients is you maybe don't want to be a test case. So having these policies be kind of voluntary, encouraging your employees to get the vaccine, all of those things are going to kind of limit your liability because nobody wants to be a test case in a brand new area of law. There's human rights issues, and we're going to kind of dive into those a little bit deeper, and privacy issues, of course, with this kind of content. Vaccination, testing, all of this is considered personal health information here in Manitoba. And if you operate in other provinces, the definition of what personal health information changes from province to province. So just be aware of that. But here in Manitoba, your vaccination status, asking an employee if they're going to get a vaccine, if they're vaccinated, if they're COVID tested, the status of or the result of that COVID test, that's considered personal health information. So that's afforded a greater level of protection, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. In a non-unionized environment, an employee can take the position that you've implemented this policy. I didn't want to get a vaccine. I was forced to quit. And we may see these kinds of things come up as what's called a constructive dismissal. And in a unionized context, there's going to be different considerations. And so you have to provide your employees, proper notice and all of that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay. Okay, so workplace safety and health. You guys are probably all pretty familiar with this, but under the Workplace Safety and Health Act, employers have an obligation to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, the safety, health, and welfare of its employees. So you guys have already made a number of adjustments to how you're operating: plexiglass shields, hand sanitizer, mask policies, distancing. Now that the vaccine is available, the question kind of becomes, is it the duty of an employer to ensure that their employees are vaccinated to protect other employees? So is it your responsibility as an employer to protect your employees by making everybody get vaccinated? The answer to this question is probably not. The government hasn't made vaccinations mandatory, and it's not going to. It's very, very unlikely that it will. And that's kind of Canada-wide. That's not just specific to Manitoba, but at this point, it's not an employer's kind of responsibility to ensure that their employees are vaccinated to keep other employees safe, but it is your responsibility to keep other employees safe. So a lot of those things, the distancing, the hand washing, the sanitizing, the masking, these are all things we're doing, and vaccines is just one more thing that we can do. But it's likely not your responsibility to make sure all of your employees are vaccinated. So under human rights legislation, obviously employers can't discriminate against anyone who has protection under one of the prohibited grounds. And so which grounds get engaged when it comes to vaccination policies? Disability, sex, and religion. So, one more. So there's going to be people who are unable to get the vaccine. Sex kind of gets involved when, perhaps a woman who's pregnant doesn't feel comfortable getting the vaccine. And so she can be discriminated on a basis of sex in that way. And there's going to be people who can't get the vaccine for a religious reason. So when making these policies, the employer must consider the potential effect on employees who can't get vaccinated. So, like we're seeing in the government and in the news, incentivization and, trying to incentivize your employees to get the vaccine. You always have to be, kind of considerate to those employees who can't get vaccinated, and they should be afforded those same kind of, incentives. I just heard of one workplace last night is giving all of their employees who are fully vaccinated $300. That's great. But if somebody can't get vaccinated for a legitimate human rights reason, you can't not give them that kind of benefit as well. So just be mindful of those things. You can't discipline employees who cannot receive the vaccine for not getting it. That seems obvious, but we'd hate to see that. You certainly have the right to inquire about, somebody's status. So if somebody says, "Oh, I can't get it for a religious reason," you have the right to ask questions. But you kind of have to be satisfied with an attestation. So if somebody says, "Yes, I attest that it's against my religion to get this vaccine," it's kind of all that's kind of all that you can ask an employee. And employers still have to continue to make a reasonable accommodation for employees who can't receive a mandated vaccine. So if for one of these reasons your employee is unable to be vaccinated, consider what accommodation is going to look like. So you guys are familiar with accommodation requests for lots of other things. Making sure somebody is safe from this kind of virus is just one more way that as employers, we're going to have to accommodate our employees. So yeah, the last point that I have here is just consider accommodation as you would in any other accommodation or request for accommodation. Okay, so privacy concerns. So like I have already mentioned, personal health information is protected, and it's afforded a greater protection than just regular personal information. So somebody's vaccine status is more protected than, let's say, their address. This includes information, like I said, about vaccination status, about exemptions for why they can't. And and seemingly innocent information can reveal additional information. So when you have a small workplace or a small job site and somebody is off because they're considered a close contact, or they have tested positive for COVID, you have to be really, really careful about how you are letting your other employees know. Basically, nobody has the right to know why that employee is off. Obviously, in a small workplace, it's going to be likely that everybody knows. I would probably tell my friends here at work, and your employees are going to tell their friends at work. But as the employer, as the supervisor, you can't be responsible for kind of sharing that information. And so it may seem really kind of innocuous, but you have to be really careful about how you're sharing that information. Again, with personal health information, it needs to be kind of kept more secure. So if you're going to be documenting who's vaccinated, or if you're going to make this policy and have your employees sign it, it needs to be kind of stored in a secure cabinet with, you should have a list of, you should let your employees know who is going to have access to this cabinet. So it's not that it's a free for all. And if it's on a computer, the drive should be locked. The computer that it's on should be maybe locked in a separate room, again with limited access. There's no clear answer really on what kind of level of proof from an employee is going to be considered reasonable. Again, like I said, this hasn't been decided in law yet, so it's going to be a push and pull of an employee's right to privacy and an employer's right to keep their workplace safe. So it's all going to be this balancing act. But I've kind of challenged my clients when they've asked me to make a policy for them. Kind of what is considered reasonable in your workplace? Do you really need a photocopy of a vaccine card? Is it enough that an employee tells you that they're double vaccinated? We require just an attestation for lots of things. Do you have a valid driver's license? Yes. We accept that in some cases. So really just think about what's necessary and why that's necessary. Do you really need a photocopy? Can somebody just show you and then you can record it? It's all about what's less intrusive to the employee. And so when you're the least amount of intrusive, you're going to be able to show that it's reasonable. So, you had an employee attest that they had the vaccine, they checked a box. That's going to be more reasonable than keeping a photocopy of their vaccination record with their personal health information. There's probably no need for that. So really think about what measure you're trying to achieve and how you need to get there. So, think about what's going to satisfy you as the employer or the workplace or the job site when it comes to what information you really need from your employees. Okay. Right, so the current state of law, like I've said already, there's no current legislation. It's very unlikely that we see it. Is it possible that we see mandatory vaccines in some sectors, like healthcare? Possibly. I mean, in Ontario, it's a requirement that I think all paramedics are vaccinated. So we see it in some sectors, in some provinces. So that's more likely, but we're very unlikely to see kind of a blanket, mandatory vaccine from the government. Charter challenges are going to be likely, just as we've seen charter challenges throughout this pandemic. People challenging whether they can still attend church and practice and worship during the pandemic, and we've seen charter challenges on limits placed to mobility. So this, closing of the interprovincial borders, people are challenging it and saying it is an infringement on their charter rights to freely move about Canada. So this is another area where we're probably going to see some charter challenges and human rights disputes on how employers can make their employees get the vaccine. There's an impact on public and private employers, and implementation of any legislation is going to need to be in accordance with that human rights legislation. That stuff is going to trump everything else, basically. Okay. So what can you do as an employer? It's not all for naught. You can, if you want to see that really, really high vaccination rate in your workplace, educate your workplace about the vaccine. incentivize them to get it, give them $300, give them a day off. People like things. It sounds really simple, but people will are happy to do things if there's some sort of additional perceived benefit to them, and facilitate it. So, like a lot of workplaces bring in a flu clinic, a flu shot clinic when it's flu season. We're not quite there yet, but this vaccine rollout has been so fast, and I know in the States they're already at this point. If you want your employees to get the vaccine, make it as easy as possible for them. This is something that you want, so there should be a little, bend on your part and make it possible for them to get it. Okay, so this is the bottom line practical advice that I was talking about. And here we're going to talk about specifically kind of construction sites and subcontractors and all of that kind of stuff. So implementing a workplace COVID-19 vaccine policy requires careful consideration. I think that much is obvious at this point. Employers should assess the particular circumstances of their workplace and consult their employees to determine their present intentions on receiving or not receiving the vaccine. Just kind of a side note on that, if you're asking your employees, again, if they're going to get the vaccine, that's personal health information. So just keep that in mind. And this kind of inquiry should be voluntary, and employees should be consenting to sharing this information with you. So just make it anonymous if you're asking these kinds of questions. Do you plan to get the COVID-19 vaccine? Make an anonymous form for your employees to fill out, and you'll get a good sense of whether a policy is going to be even necessary in your workplace, or if you're going to see that, above 70, above 80% of your employees already wanting to get the vaccine. If you do, though, however, want to implement a policy in your workplace, the logistics of how information and expectations concerning vaccination should be determined kind of well in advance. This needs to be communicated to your employees before it's brought in. Don't just, make the policy mandatory. Let your employees know that this is going to be upcoming, provide them sufficient notice. Again, that's all going to go towards helping you demonstrate that this was reasonable. Saying that you gave your employees 3 months notice that this was going to be coming into effect is going to be considered more reasonable than if you just said tomorrow, hey, you need to get the vaccine. Presently, what you need to be doing is making sure that you have sufficient and compliant COVID-19 safety plans in place. Like I said, I reviewed that one from March 2020, and let me tell you, it was not sufficient. So make sure that you are implementing these policies, enforcing them, and updating them. Doing it once is not good enough in today's rapid changing kind of world. And just, also just keep in mind that we don't really know enough about the vaccine at this point. It's going to be probably more reasonable for people to get the vaccine and for employers to make it mandatory once we know how effective it is. But we just don't know all of these things yet. Do we have to get, yearly boosters? This is all kind of things that we don't know yet. But if it's proven that it lasts a long time and it's super, super effective, it's going to be considered more reasonable probably for you to make that mandatory. But what you can be doing right now is just making sure that you still have all of those other policies in place. And even after, you make the vaccination policy mandatory, if that's something you're going to choose to do. So still, having those physical distancing, good hand hygiene, that should be all in place until we have the all clear from public health. Kind of turning specifically to the nature of the construction industry. I know that I had some questions on this last time I gave the presentation. And what I can kind of tell you is the nature of the construction site, again, is going to go to reasonableness. If you have employees working in a tight indoor space, that's going to be considered more reasonable than if they're working on a wide open outdoor space. Let's see. So a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy is going to be more reasonable for participants who can justify that they're commonly involved in high-risk construction projects. So those on or near hospitals, residential care facilities, or other sites where there's congregated or vulnerable populations. Then are others that are low risk, such as construction projects that are entirely outdoors and where physical distancing can still be maintained. Since many participants are involved in multiple work sites, over the course of a year, most organizations that aren't solely engaged in outdoor work should be able to justify that there is a high probability of high risk projects in the organization's future. So just because you're working on an outdoor project now, it's reasonable, fair to say that you're probably going to be working on an indoor project at some time in the future. Again, always consider those reasonable alternatives. Blanket policies requiring that all workers be vaccinated have generally been deemed to be unreasonable, especially in the unionized context. Given the very invasive nature of a vaccine, an employer should consider non-disciplinary alternatives to vaccination in their policies. So what we saw in the time of SARS, and what I personally am recommending to my clients, and what I think is reasonable, is kind of a vaccination. It's called a VOM policy, vaccination or mask. So, ask your employees, hey, do you want to share this information with me? You don't have to, and if you don't want to, you'll still have to wear a mask. You're going to see that a lot of employees are not going to want to wear that mask. They're going to want to tell you that they're vaccinated, and so by having them bring that information to you instead of making it mandatory, that's going to be considered all more reasonable. So sure, you don't have to tell me if you're vaccinated, but if you don't tell me, you have to wear the mask. And you're going to see people get vaccinated. You're going to see people tell you that they're vaccinated to kind of be afforded that benefit of not wearing a mask. So in the unionized context, both the union and the employer will also need to consider how a mandatory vaccination policy would apply to employees hired from union halls. Let's see here, disciplinary action, okay. When developing these COVID-19 policies, an employer must consider the disciplinary measures, if any, it's going to impose on an employee's failure to comply with the policy. So what is discipline going to look like? Are you going to terminate somebody because they won't get vaccinated? It's going to be very, very difficult for you to prove that that was reasonable. An employer may be able to dismiss an employee who refuses to be vaccinated without cause, so for paying them, proper notice, but not if that refusal is based on any of those protected grounds that we talked about. In cases where the vaccine is, not being taken up due to the employee's health condition or to a religious belief, the employer is not going to be able to impose that disciplinary action. As an employer, if you're going to make a policy, you have to think about how you're going to enforce it. If you just have this policy and then you don't really do anything about it and you're not monitoring which employees are vaccinated, which are not, and then somebody challenges it later, it's going to be really hard to prove that you really wanted this policy if the employee is able to demonstrate all these times that the policy wasn't enforced. And that's not specific to this policy. Any policy that you have shouldn't just be this blanket policy that they sign and gets tucked in a binder. Think about why you're making the policy, and if it's so important to you to make the policy, I would advise you to make sure that you're also enforcing that policy that you're choosing to implement. And if you don't want to enforce it, then maybe reconsider why you're implementing it. That's all kind of from me at this point. I have time for questions. I'm sure there's some, so please feel free to throw them in the chat.
Do you want me to read off the questions for you?
Sure, I don't see them.
Okay, I'll read them off in order of what we received in the chat, and then we can put it to the group if there's any.
Okay, sounds great.
There. So first question is, can I only hire vaccinated personnel?
So again, you're going to have to be able to prove why that's necessary. It's more likely to be reasonable, kind of honestly, to make it a condition of employment than to, put it into effect with already, people that you've already had employed. You can make it a kind of condition of the employment, but you just have to be aware of those human rights things, and that's maybe a little bit more difficult to address, and something you'll have to be thinking about. If somebody says they're not vaccinated, maybe they don't want to share their religious, views with you right off the bat, and then later saying that they weren't hired. This just, I'm kind of off the cuff here. They weren't hired because they had this mandatory policy and it was against their religion and they didn't bring that up to you. So there's things that you can, I would say that you can make it a condition of employment, but you'll have to turn your mind to those kind of areas of liability there.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. If we can have mandatory mask policies, why not mandatory vaccine policies?
Right. And I did mention this, but it's just because it's a much more intrusive thing. Making somebody wear a mask is not that intrusive on them, but making somebody get a vaccine is really different. So that's why I'm suggesting to my clients the vaccine or mask policy. I think it really, really addresses the concern of safety without being intrusive on employees. So yeah, that's why.
Next question here. So this kind of ties in, I think, but maybe a little bit different. How does this play into new hires? Are we allowed to inquire about vaccination status during an interview?
I would say yes. Yes, you can. You can ask your new hires if they're vaccinated. But again, you can ask them, can you make somebody tell you? That's really different. That's a different question. So can you ask them? Sure, you can ask whatever you want. But can you make somebody tell you?
Okay. What about people visiting the plant, customers, etc.? Can you mandate they need to be vaccinated prior to entering facility? What about contractors?
Again, that's all going to come down to whether it's reasonable. So, and again, you can ask them if they're vaccinated, and if they don't want to tell you, make them wear a mask. That's, I think, the easiest way to avoid your liability in these cases where you're having different people attend your job site. Sure, you can say, hey, are you vaccinated? They may tell you. Again, that information is private. You can't share that with other people. And if you are intending on sharing that information, you have to make sure that you have that person's consent to share it. So a policy that I just did up was for a client who dealt with the public. And so on their vaccine policy, what they had was a checkbox. It was, this is my vaccination status. Yes, you can share it with others. No, you may not. And so just give that choice to your employees, get their consent and make sure it's a really voluntary consent. But if somebody doesn't want to share that information with you, then it's reasonable for you to, require them to wear a mask.
Okay, next question. If there's a vaccine passport implemented and we have salespeople who have to travel for work, can we make it mandatory for traveling employees to get vaccinated to be able to do their job?
Again, reasonableness, that seems more reasonable. Condition of employment is that you have to travel. And if you can't travel because travel is only open to vaccinated people, then you probably can't do that job.
What if an employee working remotely refuses to return to the workplace unless everyone is vaccinated? What can we do?
That would probably be an unreasonable ask of your employee. You can demonstrate to them how the workplace is still considered safe. That kind of sounds like just a difficult employee. So it's just making sure that you're meeting your obligations as a workplace to make sure that the workplace is safe. You can then show the employee that you have met your obligations. This is how we're keeping you safe. We've implemented this vaccine or mask policy. So everyone is vaccinated or they're wearing a mask. You should feel safe. And then maybe just some personal touch on that if it's a difficult person.
Okay. Current public health order states order to self-isolate upon arrival in Manitoba. Exempt persons. 2, this order does not apply to the following persons. A, persons who are fully vaccinated against COVID-19 if they're not displaying any symptoms of COVID-19. Question is, can we require a contractor coming into a facility to provide their records in order to not have them self-isolate for 2 weeks coming into Manitoba?
Well, from my understanding, people who are traveling for work or, for essential purposes for work, they haven't been required to isolate at all. If I guess your work is non-essential and now you have people traveling to your site, yes, you can ask them for this information.
You need to give vaccination information to schools for children attending school, or even if your pet, if they have to be put in a daycare situation. Why can we not require that for employees in the workplace?
Well, you can, but like I said, your employees have rights as, you know, you can make it mandatory. And then if they choose not to, they can wear a mask. Vaccines are super intrusive. You can incentivize people. You can't make somebody get a vaccine, especially if there's reasons, if there's human rights considerations why they can't.
Okay. For our employees that need to travel outside the country, if the visiting country or company mandates mandatory vaccination, 2 doses, for a specific group of employees, can we make it mandatory?
I don't really know about that. I would say yes. That's gonna help you argue that it's reasonable. Your employees are required to travel to whichever country, to the United States, if they make that mandatory. And a condition of the employment is being able to travel to the United States. And you know what? Just thinking of travel kind of more generally, travel is an area where we have already seen kind of vaccine passports. If you want to go to certain countries, you have to get the vaccine to go there. Different kinds of flu shots, influenzas. So I would say that yes, you could probably make that a mandatory condition of their employment.
Okay, next question. Dr. Brent Rusin said on several occasions that public health concerns override human rights. Ergo, they had the legal right to close places of worship. Is this a legal interpretation for government, or does it extend to employers?
Can you repeat that question?
Yes, I think maybe Shelley, if you're there, are you able to unmute and ask the question directly, just so I don't get it wrong? And if not, I can read it again. Okay.
Yeah, no, my question was that on several occasions, Dr. Rusin said that public health concerns override human rights, and saying that, you know, they had the legal right to close places of worship. So my question is that a legal interpretation for government, or can public health concerns extend to an employer as well?
Right. So my understanding is that we have the kind of Emergency Protection Act kind of is active right now. It's engaged. And so what that does is it gives the government the ability to curtail our kind of charter of, you know, human rights rights, like mobility rights, and yes, like you know, having worship services take place online. So we are able to kind of curtail people's human rights, but that's because we have this Emergency Protections Act engaged. So it gives the government the ability to kind of put a limitation on our otherwise, you know, really free freedom. So no, you don't have, as an employer, you don't have the same kind of power as the government with the Emergency Measures Act in place.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. If we do go with the either be vaccinated or wear a mask option, would this be effective after the public health order of masks being mandatory inside is lifted? Yes.
Yeah. So after, you know, we're already seeing in the States, what the CDC is recommending is after you've been vaccinated fully for 2 weeks, you no longer have to wear a mask. As a workplace, you can still make that a requirement.
Okay. Next question here. Biggest challenge on mandatory vaccinations is the argument of infringement on human rights. Is there currently, or has there been, an test before courts?
Not with the COVID vaccine, no.
Okay, and then it continues on here. COVID is very unique in how damaging it can be for people and companies. Can its threats be argued as substantial enough if an outbreak can bankrupt a company?
I mean, probably. So like we've seen, you know, we've seen the reasonableness, the of flu shots in certain workplaces be challenged before and kind of subject to that kind of test, or with the SARS vaccine. But because COVID is so different, it's likely going to require a separate consideration just because it's had really different effects on Canada.
Excellent. Last question from the chat. Is COVID compensable if they can prove they got it in the workplace?
Ooh, this is a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. And I think that there is like a right answer and a wrong answer, so I don't want to guess on that question. But whoever asked me that question, please, you know what? Actually, I'll find the answer after this. I'll provide it to Stephen, and then they'll disseminate that to you guys because that's a really valid question and a really important one. So I'll get back to you on that.
This is Jake. I can speak to that one if you would like me to.
Great.
It is difficult to prove to the first case coming into a workplace whether or not they contracted it at work, because you never know about asymptomatic people. So that was pretty much a no-brainer. It's a no. But any subsequent cases after that, if you can prove close contact, which is 10 minutes or longer within 6 feet, there is a possibility that you can prove. We do have one case that was approved by WCB.
Great. Thanks, Jake.
Excellent. I think someone from our team has put a link in there for some more information on that one. Another question here, as an education facility, can we refuse entry to non-vaccinated folks?
As a blanket, probably not, no.
Another question, can we ask visitors if they are vaccinated to enter our business? If not, can we refuse entry?
Again, just as a blanket, probably not.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions directly from the group here that you'd like to ask Brittany? Give a few more seconds here. Usually when I start talking is when people ask the question. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to connect with Brittany, to connect with Made Safe. If Brittany end up providing us any, okay, there we go. We got one on the line here. Would truck drivers also fall into the category that we can make a vaccination mandatory if it is required to leave the country?
I would say yes.
Okay, excellent. I'll keep talking and maybe we'll get another question. So if Brittany gets, yep, there you go. Can you repeat if someone is double vaccinated, if they must still wear a mask at work?
Sure. So in the United States, after you've been vaccinated for 14 days, the CDC is no longer, making it a requirement that you have to wear a mask because you're considered safe. But your workplace can still, if you want your employees to continue wearing a mask despite their vaccination status, you can keep that kind of in place.
Excellent, thank you. And then we have another one here. If we do a vaccinated or mask policy once public health lifts indoor mandatory masks, how do you validate they're vaccinated if you can't ask?
You can ask them, but you can't make them tell you. So, hey, Brittany, do you have are you vaccinated? I'm free with that information. I'm telling everybody, yes, I'm vaccinated. I would definitely show you my card. But if somebody doesn't want to, you can't make them. So then the alternative is, if you don't want to share this information with me, I respect your right to privacy on this, but then you'll have to wear a mask. That's going to be considered reasonable.
Excellent. Another question here. Are we to follow CDC or public health when it comes
Public health. I'm just pointing to what's been happening in the States. I expect that will be, kind of a policy that we'll see, but definitely be following public health and your local kind of public health guidelines.
Excellent. If we are aware of people who don't want to get vaccinated and we offer an incentive to get vaccinated, are we being unfair?
No, but but if it's to people who haven't or have already got the vaccine, Yeah, that's a really tricky question. And like you see that what the government's done is it's made kind of the incentive open to all Manitobans, not just the ones who are now choosing to get vaccinated. And I think I think that's more fair.
Excellent.
And like I said, don't forget, if you have somebody who is unable to for a protected reason, you should be including them in those incentive programs as well.
Excellent. Any additional questions? Okay, I'm going to start talking again, and it should spur at least one last question, I would think. So any additional information we get from Brittany, we'll send out in a follow-up email to our participants. We will be sending out our presentation and the recording. Got a couple questions here. Any thoughts on the future and how we will handle fully vaccinated people who are sick with a common cold who come to work?
I have no prediction on that. I have no prediction. Your guess is as good as mine.
Interesting question for sure. Next question. What if someone says they are vaccinated but does not show proof? Will we just have to trust they are, and we cannot ask for proof if they say yes?
Like I said, you know, you can ask for proof. But do you need a photocopy? Do you just need to, because we're going to have that on our phones. As soon as you're 14 days fully vaccinated, it's going to be on your phone. Is it going to be sufficient for you to just look at it, or do you really need to take a copy of it? Again, it's all going to come down to what is the least intrusive. Obviously, the least intrusive way is just asking them. But I just saw in the news this morning, I don't know what the study was for, but it was on CTV, that apparently 1 in 5 people who aren't vaccinated would lie to get the benefit of travel. So I can understand your concern as an employer of having people lie to you, because apparently 1 in 5 would. But so yeah, so, and if that's the case, having them show you that they're vaccinated is going to be more reasonable than you taking a copy or you requesting a health record or anything like that. So you can ask for proof. Yeah.
Okay. Is an employer allowed to mark an employee with a hard hat or something of that way to tell the difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees?
I would steer clear of that. And I guess, again, you'd have to prove why that's reasonable, and I'm not really sure why that would be reasonable.
If I can address the question I asked.
Sure.
I've got many employees, and from a glance, you know, you can go around and collect the information if they're willing to give, whether they have been vaccinated or not. So that, and I go, how do I keep, I can have it on a list, but when I'm walking through who's lying to me and who isn't lying to me, I'm trying to figure out a way that I could, at a glance, see, you know, if the guy's got a yellow hard hat on and he doesn't have a mask on, he's okay. If he's got a gray hard hat on and doesn't have a mask on, he's not okay. So why don't you have your mask on? Instead of approaching, you know, just a quicker way to, is I guess what I'm.
Yeah, I would recommend against that. I would maybe try to think of something else, but I would say that you maybe don't want to identify people like that, because this is personal health information. Like I said, as the employer who collects it, you have to keep it safe and private. And if people are wearing an identifiable thing, that's going to now, you know, advertise to everybody their vaccination status.
It's going to explain their vaccination status by them not wearing a mask.
Sure. But it's also, you know, up to people whether
Right.
they want to wear the mask or share that information. It's not necessarily identifying them.
Okay.
I would say no to that.
Thank you.
Okay, workplace safety and health indicated that a contractor from out of province had to isolate when leaving the workplace and going back to the hotel, even essential workers. Is this true?
To my knowledge, and kind of in my experience, people who have an essential job do not have to isolate. So I'm not sure what that's specific, and I don't like to get into specifics when I answer questions, but I don't think that that's true, but I don't know the facts.
Yeah, I can speak on that. He basically indicated if they're here for more than 14 days, then they're fine. But he said if they're coming in here for essential work, the essential work is your workplace. After that, when they're going back into the town and the community, they're supposed to still isolate, not go golfing, etc., stuff like that. And so that came from one of the inspectors when he was doing that job inspection for us.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not familiar with like just here in Manitoba. I'm only familiar with the public health kind of guidelines in Manitoba. They may be different elsewhere. And if you're doing an essential job, and I know that when the North was under kind of a higher degree of protection, if you're traveling even within Manitoba, there was an expectation to isolate when you're going north. So I don't know where he's from or what their public health guidelines are. So maybe that's true.
Okay.
I can speak to it a little bit. It's Lisa. We've had quite a few workers from out of country that are considered essential, specifically from the US. And all our documents clearly indicate that they are exempt from the self-isolation, but they are not to go to golfing and restaurants. They have to pretty much stay in their hotel room. So they're exempt from self-isolating, entering into the province, and there's supposed to be details of where they're going and who they're visiting, right, to from their hotel to your work and back. They are not allowed to engage in outdoor activities or restaurants of any sort if they fall under the exemption at this point.
Okay, that doesn't sound though like it's from the public health order. That just might sound like a workplace policy. Is that right?
No, that's on the Travel Canada website.
Okay, well then just make sure you're following the Travel Canada website. I would have double check, maybe seek some specific counsel if you have a specific question like that.
Yeah, I think they've been pretty, because we've had to go quite a bit with a lot of exempt workers. So the health and safety that said it to this gentleman is correct, that they are exempt from self-isolating when they get to here, but they can only go between their hotel and their destination, and that's it.
Yeah.
Everything else has to be delivered to their hotel.
Okay.
Okay, next question here. We've got a few in the chat here. If we have an employee who is a high risk, is ensuring coworkers in their vicinity are vaccinated not something we can do to accommodate as per our duty?
Again, reasonableness, that would be something that would maybe be considered more reasonable. But also making somebody get a vaccine to keep somebody else safe, I would challenge you, like, what else can you do? Can you have them starting at a different time? Can you have them still working from home? It would be considered maybe more reasonable, but still you can't have a blanket kind of force a vaccine into somebody. Consider other accommodation.
Okay. Next question. If you are a service provider, are you allowed to ask a client if they are vaccinated?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. But I think it's just the same kind of standard answer. You can ask, and people are probably going to tell you, but it just becomes that voluntary, consensual sharing of information versus making somebody. And then if somebody doesn't want to, the answer is have them wear a mask. They don't have to tell you anything. So.
Okay.
If they don't want to tell you if they're vaccinated or not, alternative, accommodate.
Okay. Next question. Can an employer publicly announce the winners of a vaccine raffle?
Oh, good question. I would say yes. You may want to have, but before you do that, if you're having your employees enter this raffle, have them consent to the sharing of that information. And again, if people are entering a raffle, they probably won't mind, but I would definitely recommend having them consent to the sharing of that information.
Okay. Okay. Trying to filter through questions here. Can you instead, if we're talking about the hard hat question, kind of tying back to that, Can you instead indicate mask required on employee IDs?
I guess to whoever asked that question, who is going to have access to these? It may be reasonable if, if you're walking from one site to another and somebody's kind of monitoring who's going in and who's coming out. If that person's aware, that would probably be okay, but probably shouldn't just be hanging on their ID tag. But if there's a list and somebody knows who's supposed to be wearing a mask and who's not, that's probably okay.
Okay. Next question. If you have an employee that is anti-mask and do not want to get vaccinated, how do you keep your other employees safe? Right now, they're working as a separate shift, but not a long-term solution.
That's a really difficult situation, and that's one of the things that is really different about COVID, and that's not the same with the flu. The flu has a season, and then it typically comes to an end. So these kinds of accommodations, and we've seen vaccine or mask policies in hospitals. They've existed for a long time. But this is a really different circumstance because, long-term accommodation is not feasible in a lot of situations. You're probably going to want to seek specific counsel on that situation.
Okay.
Just to add to that, like if an employee is anti-masker, but he doesn't want to get the vaccination, what if you have other people that are vaccinated and the other person that's not vaccinated says, well, don't you trust your vaccine? So why are you getting vaccinated if you don't trust your vaccine? Why do I have to? You know what I mean? So it's kind of the double-sided sword, right?
Yeah, those are difficult questions. And I don't have a great answer for you on that. I'm sorry.
Okay. There's a couple people asking if you can do in-house sessions with their employees. So I'd encourage those people to connect with Brittany.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
You can, so connect with her there. And then another question here, last one I have in the chat as of now is, if we offer a monetary incentive, can we make it mandatory to show proof of full vaccination to accept the money?
I would say that that's reasonable, yes.
Okay, do we have any final questions? Here's another one. Why would a mask not be considered a mandatory PPE like safety glasses?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Lorraine, are you, can you unmute and ask a question there?
Well, my question is that we have people that wear hard hats, wear safety glasses. You're putting people that don't want to wear a mask and you're putting them on another shift. Why wouldn't it be considered that if it's part of the job to wear safety glasses or a hard hat, why wouldn't you wear a mask?
Oh, for sure. You can make masks a mandatory part of PPE. We've seen that kind of throughout the pandemic. You can definitely require your employees to wear a mask.
Excellent.
So then you wouldn't have to put them in another area or segregate them or anything. They just have to wear a mask.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay, there's a question related to that. If they say no to the mask, what's the employer's requirement to accommodate?
Well, it depends why they're choosing not to wear a mask. People can't, employers do have some rights. They can push back on their employees a little bit. If I told my employer that I don't want to wear a mask, they would tell me too bad, you're wearing the mask. And I wear the mask when I leave my desk. That's what's required of me, and that's what I have to do because that's what my employer tells me to do. It's considered reasonable. And then it just kind of, this is what I was talking about when it comes to enforcing these. Being careful, again, seek legal advice before you discipline somebody. When you're not sure on the answer, don't just terminate them or take away benefits from them or however you're choosing to discipline them. But you can make employees follow the rules, and that's, again, difficult people are going to be difficult people. but you can make employees follow the rules. And so maybe that's through discipline.
Excellent. Okay, in a private business, no access to public. Is it mandatory for employees to wear masks as per public health orders or a recommendation?
I am not sure. It is in the public health order, so just check the public health order or call Manitoba Inquiry. I'm not sure what it is now. I think in the last time that I was really up on the public health order, it said in a private workspace with no access to the public, employees didn't have to wear a mask. But a lot of employers made that mandatory anyway, just to keep everybody safe. Like here, we're not open to the public, still required to wear a mask at work. But the public health orders have changed, so just make sure you double check that. But in the one that was issued November 11th and then updated on the 21st, that was the case. So.
Okay, looking forward, do you think masks could become mandatory in the workplace during a flu season or through seasonal changes which causes spikes in hospitalizations?
Yes, I think that we've learned the benefits. I sure didn't know a lot of people who had the flu this season. And you probably didn't know a lot of people who had the flu either. I could see that, kind of becoming something that's here to stay as an effect of the pandemic.
Okay. Any final questions? There's been more questions than ever, I think. It's impressive. Any final questions? Give a few more seconds before we wrap up. Okay, if you have more questions, reach out to Brittany, reach out to Made Safe. We'll work together to assist you for sure. Lots of positive feedback come through the chat, Brittany, so thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. If you'd like me to give a presentation to your employees, that's what I said, educate, incentivize, facilitate. So I would be happy to do that too.